Welcome to part 2 of this series. Hopefully, you have already watched part 1 about fusion versus diffusion, but if you haven't, you can always watch the first video later. In the first video, we looked at the differences between diffusion and fusion in regard to thoughts observed as truths and how these truths affected actions. We also introduced Ted, our live subject, and some of his thoughts and struggles. The fused thoughts had a limiting effect on Ted's life, while the diffusion of thoughts could help him make different choices for his life. This second video is about two other core concepts in ACT. In acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, the concepts of self as content and self as context represent different perspectives on self-identity and self-awareness. These perspectives play a pivotal role in how individuals relate to their thoughts, emotions, memories, and other internal experiences. Here are some key points on these two concepts. Self as content. Self as content refers to the perspective in which an individual identifies with their thoughts, feelings, memories, roles, and experiences. It's the narrative or story we tell ourselves about who we are based on our past experiences, thoughts, roles, and perceived attributes. All or some of these elements have a tendency to be the basis of labels. The labels can be, for example, I am a hard-working man, I am grounded and concrete, or I am successful. Identifying strongly with self as content can make individuals more susceptible to emotional pain and suffering, especially if the content is negative or self-critical. An additional effect of self as context is a focus on detail, especially details connected to the personal self-image. Examples: I am a failure. I am an anxious person. I am a good mother. For Ted, his experiences have led him to the self-image of a man who will fail. This is very true for him, but still, a misleading identity is blocking his ability to function and choose new paths. Who he thinks he is has become his way of acting, and it is solely circling around him and his own mind. In a way, he has isolated himself from change and from the people surrounding him, putting him in a spot where he has to defend his perceived self-image. Limitations: viewing oneself strictly based on self as content can lead to a rigid sense of self. If one's narrative is predominantly negative, it can contribute to avoiding experiences that contradict this narrative, thereby limiting personal growth. It might be true for you as well, either as your own experience or as your observation of people around you. When you meet a person who is caught in a self as context situation, you will often hear them refer to themselves as what they do. Often, this reference goes to their line of work or their involvement in social or familiar activities. Why don't you take a minute, pause this video, and reflect on how you present yourself? Self as context. Self as context is the broader perspective of the self that is constant, ever-present, and observes all experiences. It's the observing self that can witness thoughts, feelings, and sensations without becoming entangled with them. Connecting with self as context can help individuals distance themselves from the content of their internal experiences and provide a stable perspective from which to observe them without judgment. With this background, it gives the person a wider view of the world, the person in relation to others, and the ability to adapt and adjust to the people and the surroundings. This perspective promotes psychological flexibility, allowing individuals to respond to situations based on their values rather than being overly influenced by transient internal states. Here are some examples of metaphors for self as context. To go from self as content to self as context, it can be useful to use metaphors and, by them, get a new view of one's own thoughts. Let me give you some more details on this subject. A metaphor is meant to change perspective on a certain situation or action. Often, actions are bound by the way thoughts are being dealt with, and if the premises for dealing with thoughts are changed, the actions can change as well. As stated earlier, thoughts can be seen as truth and facts. If we use the metaphor of a chessboard, our thoughts, feelings, and memories are like chess pieces moving across a board. They will constantly change positions, and they will have different predefined functions. The struggle between the chess pieces will be experienced as life, truths, and facts. But in fact, they are changing. The only stable and reliable in the chess game is the board itself. In this metaphor, the board itself represents self as context. while the pieces, or content, may change, the board remains constant. The sky and weather metaphor is another way of presenting the differences between constants and change. In the sky and weather metaphor, our fleeting thoughts and feelings are like the weather, constantly changing, while self as context is the vast sky that remains unchanged by the weather patterns. Examples: recognizing that I am having the thought that I am a failure rather than simply identifying with I am a failure. Being aware of anxiety without becoming engrossed in it, thinking, I am noticing the feeling of anxiety. For Ted, this means that as soon as he manages to correct his inward focus and detach from his own thoughts and details, he will be able to see the world, the people, and the surroundings in a new light. So, instead of presenting himself as a loser by evading situations and people that could expose him, he could be able to watch interactions, systems, and conventions that constitute the environment he lives in. Think for a while what it would mean to you if you presented yourself as a part of a bigger system. Picture the difference between a violinist presenting as a single performer and a violinist presenting as a part of an orchestra. In ACT, fostering an understanding of self as context is pivotal because it helps individuals develop a more flexible and compassionate relationship with themselves. By recognizing that they are not solely defined by their thoughts, emotions, or roles, self as content, individuals can make choices aligned with their values and desired life directions, regardless of the transient internal experiences they might be having. Hopefully, this short video has made the differences clearer and what results can be expected. Seeing oneself as self in context gives the opportunity to view life and life circumstances from a different and wider perspective. When doing this, it's easier to adopt a more flexible and adaptive lifestyle.